If you've ever visited or are thinking about visiting Denali National Park, you likely know that there's only one road in the whole park, the Denali Park Road. You might also know that from May through September, you can only drive your personal vehicle along the first 15 miles of that road, which is paved. After that, you'll have to charter a bus for the remaining 77 miles, which is gravel. You could also walk it or bike it, but either way, you can't drive your car. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. Denali is mostly a wilderness park, with more than a third protected as federally designated wilderness area. Beyond that federal designation, though, Denali is still a largely wild place. You simply won't find many of the trappings of our modern world here. From its very outset even, Denali was different. It was established in 1917 as a game refuge for, quote, recreation purposes by the public and for the preservation of animals, birds, and fish, and for the preservation of the natural curiosities and scenic beauties thereof, end quote. At that time, the fact that wildlife preservation was included as one of the foundational reasons for Denali's protection was a novel idea for national parks. Up to this point, parks were mainly protected for scenic beauty and recreational opportunities. But with Denali, wilderness and wildlife now had a seat at the table as well. It's that wilderness character which has influenced the park's road policy. In an effort to protect Denali from overdevelopment and habitat degradation, in 1972, park officials implemented the mandatory bus policy past the Savage River Bridge. Officially, the policy was introduced to, quote, protect wildlife viewing opportunities, wildlife health and habitat, and the wilderness character of the park road, end quote. To open up the park road beyond Savage River, to encourage mass visitation and development beyond that point, would simply be incompatible with these objectives. Which is why you can only drive your car on the first 15 miles of the Denali Park Road. But the Park Service hasn't always had this mindset. Despite the park's enabling legislation in Denali's early days, substantial development was expected and encouraged, centered of course on the Denali Park Road. The first plans for the road were envisioned by one of Denali's pioneering voices, Charles Sheldon. He was instrumental in the creation of the park in the first place, and as a hunter was a big proponent of wildlife preservation. This helps to explain why wildlife featured so heavily in Denali's enabling legislation. But Sheldon also saw Denali as more than just a game refuge. Like many parks at the time, Sheldon saw Denali as being ripe for tourist potential as well. He envisioned a park lodge at the foot of Peters Glacier, right at the base of Denali itself, and to access that lodge, he envisioned a 90-mile road from the park's headquarters, which was located near the Alaska Railroad station at the time. It wasn't until Denali started receiving funds from Congress, however, that plans for a road really started to heat up. When this happened, the park's first superintendent, Harry Karstens, agreed with Sheldon's idea for a lodge at Peters Glacier, along with the road to get there. They began developing plans with the Alaska Road Commission to choose the best possible route. But the Alaska Road Commission didn't want the road to run to the foot of Peters Glacier. It wanted the road to run to the Kantishna mining camp, which would also be roughly 90 miles from the park headquarters, but would terminate instead just outside the park's northern boundary, not at the foot of Denali. This meant no park lodge. But the Park Service needed the ARC on their side since they were the ones, building the road. So they agreed to the route. Construction began in 1923 and was completed in 1938. It was, of course, an unimproved and rugged road, a purely functional ribbon of development granting access to Denali's vast wilderness interior. And at the time, virtually nobody opposed the road. All parties agreed that it was a necessary development if Denali was to be opened up for public use and enjoyment. No, the so-called battle over the Denali Park Road would not come to pass for roughly 20 more years. At that time, two big infrastructure projects thrust the Denali Park Road firmly into the spotlight, pitting public use and enjoyment against preservation, by this time a familiar refrain when it came to national park issues, and on this channel. The first was the development of the Denali Highway, completed in 1957, and which ran from the Richardson Highway in eastern Alaska all the way to Cantwell, just outside the boundaries of Denali National Park. Despite being an unimproved gravel road, the Denali Highway was the first time Denali National Park was connected with the Greater Alaska Road Network. By this time, personal automobiles are widely available, and being able to actually drive to Denali meant visitation to the park drastically increased. At the same time, the National Park Service is undertaking this massive agency-wide infrastructure initiative called Mission 66. The goal of Mission 66 was, by 1966, the 50th anniversary of the Park Service, to implement a series of large capital projects all across the national park system to improve the visitor experience. We're talking roads, utilities, and visitor centers. And in Denali, we're talking Denali Park Road. The plan was to widen, pave, and stripe the entire length of the Denali Park Road, plus add guardrails in certain areas. The ultimate aim of this newly improved road was to vastly improve the visitor experience along it, and make the park accessible to more visitors. And this is where a veteran biologist by the name of Adolph Murie enters the fray. Born in 1899 in Minnesota, Murie first came to Alaska in 1922 to study caribou with his brother Olaus. He would go on to be a distinguished biologist and was actually hired by the National Park Service in 1934. Murie studied wildlife ecology, and one of his most famous studies actually took place in Denali. That study concerned the relationship between wolves and Dall sheep in the park. At the time, it was thought sheep numbers were declining due to overactive wolf predation, which was used as a justification for a policy of predator control in the park. Murie's study, however, revealed that it was actually severe weather late into the winter season which was having an adverse impact on the sheep, not the wolves. Not only that, Murie also found that wolves played a key role in Denali's ecosystem, an assertion widely contrary to popular belief at the time, but which is largely accepted as a tenet of predator ecology today. It was this understanding of natural relationships which led Murie to oppose large-scale developments in Denali National Park, especially when it came to the park road. He feared that should the park develop too much, it would fragment and degrade the landscape, impacting wildlife populations and the park's wilderness character. He first voiced his opinions on the matter in 1956, stating that increased development would impact the purity of wilderness atmosphere in Denali. 2 years later, he would rail against the design of the Eielson Visitor Center, claiming it looked like a Dairy Queen and calling it a monstrosity. He thought it should complement the natural landscape and blend into the tundra, not stick out and draw attention to itself. This was, of course, the same time those large-scale improvements were being planned for the Denali Park Road. So Adolph, along with his brother Olaus, being the good conservationists they were, fought them. They opposed the improvements to the park road, along with any major developments that went along with it. Olaus had this to say in 1959, quote, "The national park will not serve its purpose if we encourage the visitor to hurry as fast as possible for a mere glimpse of scenery from a car and a few snapshots. Rather, there is an obligation inherent in a national park to help the visitor get some understanding, the aesthetic meaning of what is in the place," end quote. Park Service officials acknowledged these arguments, but maintained the park road was in dire need of improvements and continued on with their plans. Still, the Muries persisted. They wrote spirited articles in National Parks magazine, including dedicating an entire issue to Denali, in order to voice their opposition to the road improvements. Again, they gained the attention of senior Park Service officials. This time, Assistant Director A. Clark Stratton wrote to Director Conrad Worth, suggesting a series of, quote, telescoping standards for the road improvements, essentially stating that development intensity on the road would taper off the further the road pushed into the park. It was unclear, however, whether the Park Service would fully commit to this for the future. So, the Muries persisted further. They encouraged the public to write letters in opposition to the road improvements. And write they did. Letters flooded in, asking the Park Service to halt road improvements and preserve the wilderness character of Alaska's marquee park. Those letters did the trick. In 1965, the National Park Service announced its intention to halt road improvements beyond the Teklanika River crossing, committing to only minor improvements for maintenance and repairs. It's also important to keep in mind here that road construction was still occurring while the Muries were waging their preservation campaign. In that time, the park road had been widened 26 miles from the park's entrance to the Teklanika River crossing, and, you guessed it, paved 15 miles from the park entrance to the Savage River crossing. The same 15 miles beyond which you can no longer drive your personal vehicle. Yet another threat arose, though, in 1972, with the completion of the George Parks Highway, which connected Anchorage to Fairbanks. This single piece of infrastructure did more than anything before it to open up Denali to the greater world of automobile tourism, again threatening to flood the park with visitors and revive the arguments in favor of road expansion. No such fight came to bear, however. That same year, Park Service Director George Hartzog put his foot down, claiming the Denali Park Road would remain as it was, no improvements beyond the Teclanica River. The Muries had gotten their wish. The Denali Park Road would remain wild. In June of that year, the Park Service implemented the same bus policy which remains to this day, one which mandates you take a bus beyond the Savage River, which is why you can only drive the first 15 miles of the Denali Park Road. If you want to learn more about the world's protected places, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me bring more park stories like this one to more people. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.